What's up everybody, and welcome back to the channel for another episode in the Ask Me Anything series. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend, enjoyed the NHL All-Star festivities, and if you're a fellow Nova Scotian like myself, I hope you stayed safe and enjoyed being snowed in for the entire weekend. As always, when it comes to this series, I want to give a huge thank you to every single one of you who took the time to come up with a question and leave it on the post. Even the questions that don't get featured in the video, just know I read every single one, and I appreciate all of you guys. You all make these interactive videos so much fun for me to do. If you guys enjoy this Ask Me Anything series, or maybe you want to see a different type of interactive video next Monday, then leave this video a like. That's the best way to show your support. Let's see if we can't hit 800 likes on this episode. And of course, if this is your first time checking out the channel and you want NHL content just like this all year round, hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, let's go ahead and start this episode off with the first question from Eliminator, who says, there seems to be a big premium on centers this deadline. Do you think we could see a big name center that nobody expects be dealt because the offer is just too good for the team to say no to? I feel like even before the Lindholm and Monahan trades, the market for centers leading up to this year's trade deadline was weaker than usual in terms of the guys that are, involved in trade rumors and featured on trade boards and stuff like that. However, now after those two guys have been dealt and other GMs seen the type of return those players got, especially Monahan fetching a first-round draft pick, I definitely think there's a strong possibility that we could see some guys be traded, some centers be traded that nobody really expected and that weren't involved in trade rumors. I mean, I feel like that happens every year. There's at least a couple of trades that just come out of nowhere as far as who those players could be. Trevor Zegras' name comes to mind. He's been talked about a lot over the last few months, and if the Anaheim Ducks are indeed going to trade him, or at least explore the option of trading him, I don't feel like they're going to rush it, so that one's kind of a real long shot. Morgan Frost is another guy, a younger centerman who has sort of struggled this season under John Tortorella after putting up 46 points last year, but he's a guy who I feel like has kind of had his name thrown around in trade talks, so I guess that one really wouldn't come out of left field. I'm really interested to hear your guys' take on this question though. I'm sort of drawing a blank here. Again, aside from Lindholm and Monahan, there wasn't really a lot of top end centers that were on the trade market, so be sure to let me know down below in the comments who are some centers that aren't really getting talked about a lot in trade rumors right now that you feel like could, surprise everybody and be dealt in the next month or so. The next question we have comes from this Asian dude who says, which NHL player slash team would benefit the most from a Stanley Cup from a legacy personal standpoint, i.e. McDavid, Matthews, Makar, etc. If these guys get a cup, second in Makar's case, it guarantees their Hall of Fame induction and cement themselves as NHL greats if they haven't already. Really interesting question, and thank you for the support. I'm glad you enjoyed this series. I feel like all the players that you listed off here, McDavid, Matthews, Makar, are already viewed as all-time greats, and whether they win a cup or not, they will eventually be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. That's just my opinion, but I definitely think the person that could benefit the most from a Stanley Cup would have to be Austin Matthews. I mean, up until this point in his career, we know he's a generational goal scorer. In my opinion, he's going to go down in history as maybe the greatest Leaf of all time when it's all said and done, and one of the best goal scorers the league has ever seen. But the criticism of his game obviously has been playoff success, or lack thereof, I should say. He's won one round in his entire NHL career so far. There's been times in Matthews' career in the playoffs where he's disappeared and his game did not look anything close to the way it looked in the regular season. He plays in the most difficult market in hockey in Toronto, obviously heavily criticized when you don't perform, heavily praised when you do. So from a legacy standpoint, not even just the three players you mentioned, but honestly everybody in the league, I think Matthews' legacy would benefit the most from a Stanley Cup. I know there's going to be people in the comments that are saying, well, McDavid hasn't won a Stanley Cup either. True, but he has had a lot more postseason success than Austin Matthews. He's got a conference finals appearance, has an absurd amount of awards from the regular season when it comes to Hart trophies, Art Ross trophies, and things like that. McDavid is going to be a guy that when it's all said and done, and honestly I feel like he's in that conversation now of one of the best players that has ever played. Sure, would his legacy benefit from Stanley Cup? Of course it would, but I think Matthews would a little bit more. The next question we have comes from Nick Holmes, who says, with the Olympics and other tournaments coming back, who do you think Canada's next up-and-coming goalie is for 2025-26? Skinner, Hill, or maybe somebody like Levi or Wolf come in and play absolutely nuts to steal a spot? Goaltending is definitely the weakest position for Team Canada when it comes to building a best-on-best roster. You see everyone's roster predictions and the forwards and defense just looks absolutely unstoppable, and then you get to the goaltenders and it's a bit of a head-scratcher. I feel like there isn't really one consensus answer for who the starter should be for Team Canada. When I was watching, I can't remember what it was, the skills competition or the All-Star game, but there was a panel, something that was on my TV this week, and it was Elliot Friedman and a couple of other people, and they were giving their predictions for Team Canada's roster, and I think it might have been Elliot Friedman who had Samuel Montembeault as one of the goaltenders. Listen, I'm no Samuel Montembeault hater, but him being one of the best options in net for Canada in a best-on-best tournament, that's not great. If I had to pick a starter and backup for Team Canada right now, I think I would have to go with the two guys you mentioned first in Stuart Skinner and Aiden Hill. I could see Canada wanting to go with, more experienced veteran goaltenders, but listen, Stuart Skinner, with the exception of the start of the season, has been great in his short career so far. He knows what it's like to play under the pressure of playing for, a Canadian market, and obviously there's a lot of pressure playing for Team Canada in a best-on-best. Aiden Hill's another guy who hasn't been, a starting caliber goaltender for a long time, but since he's become a starter in Vegas, he's been unbelievable. He's won a Stanley Cup, so he knows what it takes to win. In my opinion, those are Canada's best two options right now, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see who eventually ends up representing Team Canada, whether it's in the Four Nations tournament or in the Olympics in 2026. Obviously, it should be said a lot of it is probably going to depend on how the next season and a half go for a lot of these goaltenders. Moving along now to the next question. This one comes from Hugh Barkhurst, who says, what would you do with Jake Guentzel if you were Kyle Dubas? I'm going to say right from the get-go, I do not envy Kyle Dubas. He is in a very tough position right now. I feel like Penguins fans are sort of divided on this. I've seen a lot of Pens fans say that they don't think they should trade Guentzel by any means, and others saying they absolutely should, and he's way too good of a player to potentially lose for nothing. And I can see both sides of the argument. Jake Guentzel is one of those guys that would fetch the Pittsburgh Penguins a premium return at the deadline, and one that would really help Pittsburgh kickstart their rebuild, which we know is coming. It's inevitable. We just don't know when. So losing a top line player like Guentzel for nothing would definitely hurt the organization. But on the other hand, you don't know how many years you have left of guys like Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and I'll throw Erik Karlsson in there, playing at an elite level, and trading a top line player like Jake Guentzel. I feel like that's kind of just pulling the plug on this season for the Pittsburgh Penguins, which would be sort of a complete 180 from the direction they were headed when they entered the season after trading for somebody like Erik Karlsson with, an 11-something million dollar cap hit. I feel like the most likely outcome is we see Kyle Dubas hold on to Jake Guentzel, and he's not traded ahead of the deadline because, again, that would sort of be just pulling the rug out from under the Penguins this season, and I can't see him doing that his first season as GM of the Penguins to, guys like Crosby, Malkin, Letang, Karlsson, like I mentioned. There is definitely a lot of risk involved if Kyle Dubas does indeed hold on to Jake Guentzel without an extension ahead of the trade deadline, because that's something that could absolutely blow up in his face. Imagine if the Penguins don't trade Jake Guentzel, they don't sign him to an extension, they end up missing the playoffs, and he leaves for nothing. That is just a complete disaster. Penguins fans, I really want to know your guys' thoughts on this though, so sound off down below in the comments. Do you think the Penguins should hold on to Jake Guentzel and make that push for the playoffs, or head in a different direction and decide to sell him off and likely get some premium future assets? This next question comes from Brandon Weiss, who says, thoughts on the All-Star games? You know what? I'm usually someone who doesn't care to even watch the majority of the All-Star festivities, but for whatever reason, this year, I actually really enjoy myself. I watched the skills competition, I watched the draft, and I watched the games. I think Toronto was a great host. I'm a fan of the new format when it comes to the skills competition, and let's be real, why I enjoy myself so much probably had a lot to do with Tate McRae being there. Anytime she's on my TV, I will be seated, I will be paying attention. Thought she absolutely killed it in her performance, so overall, I had a fun weekend, and I mean, there wasn't really much else to do for Nova Scotians here. Again, we were really snowed in, so kind of had no choice but to watch the All-Star festivities, and I'm glad I did. This next question comes from RJ, who says, what are your thoughts on players like Kucherov who don't put in effort at the NHL All-Star game when the league is trying to promote the best players in the world? Do you think there's anything that can be done by the league to combat this? So to be honest, I really wasn't bothered by it, and I mean, it was more so the skills competition. I thought he was, putting in some effort in the 3-on-3 games itself, but in the skills competition, he did not give the slightest crap about any of it. I actually thought it was pretty funny, but I can see why some people were outraged. I mean, you were able to make bets on the skills competition. I actually made a decent amount of money betting on Connor McDavid, so shout out McDavid. But just picturing somebody that maybe put a wager on Nikita Kucherov to win it, and then they watch that, I mean, I could see why maybe they'd be frustrated. I saw a lot of people voicing their outrage on Twitter saying, you make all this money, the least you can do is put in a little bit of effort for the league at the All-Star festivities and stuff like that. But yes, these guys make a lot of money, and they live great lives, but they're human too at the end of the day, and I'm sure Nikita Kucherov being in Toronto in the dead of the winter while all of his teammates were probably vacationing someplace warm, I can see maybe why he wouldn't care to be there, right? As far as what the league could do to combat this, I really don't know, and I mean, it was really only Kucherov this year. I don't think this is something that's gonna, be a problem for years to come. Maybe they could make the All-Star game optional for players that are 30 years or older and have already been to, multiple All-Star games or something like that, but but I don't really know. At the end of the day, the fans paying to be there want to see the best players in the league, so I don't really see the NHL doing anything to combat this. The next question we have comes from Thomas, who says, thoughts about the Pens signing Puljujarvi for 2 years, 2-way contract. Not really a whole lot to break down when it comes to the signing. It's a low risk, I would say low reward move. It adds depth to the Penguins. Jesse Puljujarvi is a guy whose offense really dried up last season. The guy just could not find the back of the net, and that's after scoring at around a half point per game pace the 2 seasons prior with the Oilers after returning from Finland. Puljujarvi is a guy who's had fantastic defensive analytics throughout his career. He's, a good skater for his size, decent forechecker, but probably not going to provide a ton of offense. And, a third or fourth line shutdown role, think he can do just fine, and you never know, maybe he can find that goal scoring touch, when he had 15 goals in 55 games back in 2021, but I highly doubt it. The next question we have comes from Thylacine, who says, what would be your top 5 mock draft for 2024? I'm thinking after Celebrini it goes Demidov, Yzerman, Saleyev, Levshinov, and Lidstrom. As I'm sure most of you could tell by the way I pronounced a lot of those names, I really don't know a whole lot about this upcoming draft class, outside of Macklin Celebrini, of course. I feel like in the earlier years of me making videos on YouTube, I was always making prospect videos and making mock drafts, really early in the season, and that's because Detroit was just so bad that I was always just immediately focused on the upcoming draft, who could the Red Wings potentially get and things like that. Now that they've finally started to get a little bit better and shouldn't be drafting, in the top 5 and things like that, I'm starting to focus on the upcoming draft class a lot later in the year, and I really haven't dove into it yet. I'll probably start to dig into it a little bit and do some research after the trade deadline, and then maybe make my first mock draft sometime in April. That's my plan currently. But yeah, really outside of Celebrini being probably the consensus #1 overall draft pick, don't know a whole lot about this draft class. I'm not really, your guy when it comes to prospects this year especially. And now finally finishing out the episode with the last question from Cardinal Treehouse, who says, do you agree with Nathan McKinnon that the trade deadline should be earlier in the season than it currently is? His justification was that 20 games with the new team isn't enough to get acclimated to the new systems and teammates before the playoffs. I think he makes a really good point. I also think having it so close to the All-Star game kind of sucks. You see players traded during All-Star weekend, especially All-Stars. We've seen it with Bo Horvat last year, Elias Lindholm this year. A weekend that's supposed to be kind of a getaway and escape for players, getting traded during all of that is probably a pretty big headache. I can see why the NHL doesn't move it back, though, because you want teams to have as much time possible to kind of know what direction they should be headed in. 55, 60 games into the season, which I think is around when the deadline will be this year, you kind of have a good idea of if your team is going to be a legit contender, a playoff contender, or not, if you should be buyers or sellers. So if you had it, at around the halfway point in the season, it wouldn't give teams as much time to really see what kind of team they have. Like, just for an example, last year at around the halfway point, the Winnipeg Jets had one of the best records in the league. I think they were atop the Western Conference. Imagine if the trade deadline happened when they were in that position, they probably would have spent some future assets to really bolster their lineup, and it would have backfired because they fell off a cliff during the second half. Same thing can be said back when St. Louis won the Cup around the halfway point in the season. They were one of the worst teams in the NHL. If the trade deadline happened when they were in the basement, they probably would have sold off some guys and maybe would never have went on that miraculous run and won the Stanley Cup. So I don't think the NHL is really ever going to change it, and I feel like there is pros and cons to moving it back or keeping it how it is. So that is going to wrap up this week's episode of the Ask Me Anything series. Like I mentioned at the start, if you guys want to see another episode next Monday, or maybe a different kind of interactive video, then leave a like on this. That's the best way to let me know that you enjoyed. Again, huge shout out to all of you who left a question on the post. You all killed it with the questions as per usual. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want NHL content just like this all year round, hit that subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all again soon.